Hello everyone, and welcome to Get Your Development Program Started on the Right Foot, presented by Roe. I'm Michael Gibney, Production Editor for Fierce Markets Life Sciences, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are David Shoemaker, PhD, Senior Vice President of R&D, Jack Modell, MD, Senior Medical Officer, Dana Minnick, PhD, Senior Research Scientist, Scott Burian, PhD, Senior Research Scientist. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window. Just a few technical notes before we begin. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Files button at the lower left of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. We will follow the presentations by a Q&A session. Please submit your questions during or after the presentations, clicking the Q&A button in the lower left corner of the screen. Okay, now let's begin. David, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. So here you have the pictures of the motley crew that's going to be presenting today. I think the one thing in common among all four of us is that we have been down to regulatory authorities on a pretty regular basis and have negotiated with them on different topics. Jack is a physician, obviously, and is focused on the clinical development plan in both these documents we're going to be talking about. Dana is a toxicologist, and she also will be focusing on that. And finally, Scott is an expert in chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. But I want to point out that all of them are infused with regulatory experience, which is critical to both of these documents. So these are the two documents we're going to be talking about today, the Target Product Profile and the Integrated Product Development Plan. These are two documents that there's a lot of ambiguity surrounding the preparation of these documents by different companies and by regulatory authorities. FDA actually has a guidance out on the TPP. So what we want to do is ask you to focus on the content that we're going to be talking about today. What should be in each of these documents, no matter what format it takes. And it can be as complex as a 100-page document. It can be a 10-page Microsoft PowerPoint presentation. The important thing is that your team understands what's in these documents and they are aligned in the development of your product, keeping these documents in mind. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jack and have him start off with the TPP.
Great. Thank you, David. Thank you, David, and welcome everybody. So obviously the first slide clearly says what is a TPP, and some of you are probably saying, well, I could Google that, and you certainly could. And what I want to do today, though, is not give you so much the literal definition of the TPP, but to talk more figuratively, more broadly about what it is, how it can be used, and how it can be helpful to you. So obviously a key strategic planning document, and the main purpose and design of the TPP is to give everybody up front, and up front means phase one or even pre-phase one, a clear understanding of the requirements and expectations of the ultimate outcome of product development. And a TPP and all drug development programs have to be driven not primarily by how to make a quick dollar or what one or two people might think the world needs, but by true unmet patient, physician, and payer needs at the time of launch. And I say this not just because, well, frankly, it's the right thing. It sounds very altruistic. We're not going to develop anything that the world doesn't need. In today's day and age, in the U.S., Europe, actually probably most of the world, you're not going to get reimbursement unless you can show that your product is offering something that other products don't. Or if your product is the same price as a generic, you might not have to do that. But that's usually not the goal of developing a product, is to price it as low as possible. The TPP is also a roadmap of key go, no-go decision points. And this is really critical. And it's a place where a lot of companies, a lot of drug developers go wrong by not setting out ahead of time. What are your minimum criteria for continuing the development of that product? Now, some people say, well, can go, no-go criteria be aspirational? Well, yes, they can, and your TPP can be aspirational, but you also have to have a set of minimum go, no-go criteria where you know you're going to stop development, or at least stop that particular line of development if something isn't met. And I see this unfortunately violated all the time, and it does not usually have a good outcome. So if you decide ahead of time that one of the minimum go, no-go criteria would be the drug has to be effective in at least half the patients, and maybe another is that it's well tolerated, and maybe another is that it has an onset in the first week of administration. And then typically what happens is you discover, well, it's not 50% of patients, it's 40%. Someone says, well, 40, that's pretty close to 50, let's keep going. And it's not 1 week, but it's 10 days to 2 weeks. And someone says, well, 10 days, that's only 3, let's keep going. And you have a lot of nausea, and you keep going. You're going to spend an awful lot of money to end up with a drug that works in less than half of the people you treat, that takes twice as long as everything else, and makes them throw up. So yeah, you've got something at the end to show for it, but unfortunately it's not what you needed to, in most cases, even recoup your development costs. So we're going to talk more about go, no-go decision points as we go along, but having that set of minimum decision points is really important. And the TPP also contains a statement of the overall intent of the product development program. And so often I hear, well, it's really just a draft product label. But no, it is so much more than that, as you've already heard, but discusses the overall intent of the program and several other things. It's a differentiated value proposition, meaning basically the TPP should answer the question, why should I prescribe the drug? What good is there in it for patients? Do the drug's characteristics, potential benefits justify the cost? So whether you're developing the drug to sell it on the market or maybe to sell it to another company or another developer, your TPP will show what the drug is likely to be worth and why, and all the steps you need to get there. It does contain a summary of all the studies that justify your labeling claims. It's a communication tool, and hopefully a better one than the squashed cans. I think that's what I'm seeing on the left side there. But it's a communication tool because it's a map, it's an outline that is shared throughout the company that serves as a common focus for everybody in the company to look at, to see what you're developing, where you are in your development program, that's a snapshot in time, and what the accumulating data say to date. It's a dynamic and multidisciplinary document. Dynamic meaning obviously the opposite of static. It's not something that you write one day and revisit 3 years later. It's continually updated, changed with new information. And multidisciplinary because, as I think I'll discuss, probably will discuss further, it's not something that one or two people do at their desk. The CEO doesn't do it, the CMO doesn't do it, the project leader doesn't do it. You've got to get everybody around the table from senior management to project management, your medical people, your marketing people, to decide what needs to go in here, and then have the same people at the table to check on the progress and make updates as you go along. Now, while it's not just the product label, it is a good starting point for the annotated package insert because many of the key components of the TPP will map to your label. For those who want a somewhat more literal interpretation of what a TPP is, you can find this, some guidance by the FDA. I guess you can't click on that link right now. You can when you get the slides, or you could just Google Guidance for Industry Target Product Profile. And I've heard some people say, well, it essentially just says it's your draft label. But actually, the FDA doesn't just say that. They give a little more of a context, explaining that the purpose, as I said, it is a format for discussions to be used throughout the development process, beginning with the goal in mind. It describes the overall intent of the program and gives you detailed information about the drug at a particular time in development. And as mentioned, it's a dynamic summary that does change as knowledge of the drug changes. So having the TPP focuses development. It is so easy for somebody to say, you've all experienced this partway along, hey, let's do a study showing A or B or C. And a lot of you are thinking, yeah, but we're not going to A, B, and C. Or somebody gets a great idea about sticking 20 secondary endpoints or exploratory endpoints in a study that really don't help you meet that target product profile. Those sort of things can only hinder development. And actually, it's a bit of an analogy and kind of a sidebar, but I look at a clinical study as like taking a boat across a river. You want to get from one side of the river to the other. Okay, if you put nothing in the boat, that's great. Your boat gets across and you're stuck on the other side and you haven't achieved anything. But you also don't want to overload that boat. And we see this all the time, whether we're talking about the whole development in the TPP or an individual study. The more you put in that boat, especially things that are not necessary to have on the other side, the greater the chance that you and the boat sink and don't get across. So be careful in your clinical studies and on your TPP. While it's aspirational, be focused and really focus on the core needs that you have to develop and market that product. So that's the required studies, no more, no less. It forces you, it requires you to compare with similar products because, you know, if you're the very first product to treat something, that's great. There's nothing similar. But in today's day and age, very competitive marketplace, and you need to know where your drug is going to excel and also where it may fall short because that will really help you with your competitive positioning. As you get new information, as I've said, constant updating is required. And these go, no-go decision points are forced. Looks like go and decision got forced there, actually. But the go, no-go decision points are not optional. They're in your plan. They force everybody to get together to say, did we meet it or did we not? And again, I mean, the road on the side gives me another analogy maybe you don't need, but I've seen too many people make too many excuses about go, no-go criteria. So using a road example, if you're in Chicago and you're driving to New York, your first go, no-go criteria is you're going to see a big lake on your left. The second is another big lake. The third might be a sign that says Cleveland 10 miles ahead. If you start on your path and you don't see a big lake and somebody says, yeah, but these prairies are really nice, and then you see a sign that says Omaha 20 miles and someone says, well, Omaha's a nice place, why not go there? You're ending up against the Rocky Mountains. You're not ending up in New York, and you've spent a whole lot of money that unfortunately you're not going to be able to do much with. So when is the TPP needed? This is the long answer. Actually, the short answer is as early in development as possible. Now, what you see on this slide does not mean that the FDA expects you to walk in with the TPP at your pre-IND meeting or your end of phase 1 meeting, but it means that you as a development program need to have this in your pocket for or before all of those meetings. Again, and in your head, that's probably even better. Everybody needs to understand, breathe, and live this. And that way, when you go to each of these meetings and you have each of these milestones, you know where you are relative to where you're supposed to be and whether you're going to end up in New York or against the Rocky Mountains. So establish the targets early and begin with the end in mind. So what does this mean? I can tell a little story. When I first came to GSK, about, I don't know how long ago anymore, 15 years ago, I had just come from 20 years in academia. And I remember sitting down to develop my first TPP. And marketing was there, the biology group was there, early clinical development, the whole clinical development team. And they were saying, okay, what do we want our studies to show? And they kept talking about, okay, this study has to show this study has to show this is what this drug is going to do, this is what this drug can't do. And I said, guys, you got to be kidding. That is not the way you do research. You can't start out by saying your studies have to show something. You do the studies with an objective mind, thinking there's a 50-50 chance of anything, and then the studies will show you what they show you, not the other way around. And they were nice to me, but basically said an equivalent of what you see here that Yogi Berra said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll be lost when you get there. So no, they were not trying to say to bias the studies to show what you want, but to say that if we know what we want, we know the kind of studies we have to demonstrate that, if indeed they're going to demonstrate that. And if they fall short, they fall short, and you take a different tack. If you take the pure scientific approach that I was advocating and do all your studies first and then see what they say, you've spent an awful lot of money, and again, you're not going to know where you are. So as I mentioned, it is an interdisciplinary activity. You want your various project teams or representatives from the project teams, clinical, non-clinical, CMC, regulatory, and your labeling and marketing teams need to be there. Now, it's kind of a side issue, but in today's day and age, and some would argue that it should always have been this way, marketing teams do not design your clinical trials. They should not be deciding what goes in them scientifically. They should not be the primary group that interprets the results. That is science and medicine driven. But that does not mean that marketing has no role. Because again, you know, when I came to industry, I was like, what do I need marketing for? Just develop the thing and see how it works. Well, the world is much more complex than that. Marketing has to be there for input, but not to design or interpret your scientific trials. You need interdisciplinary and senior management input and buy-in early and often, because this will prevent what we've all experienced, senior management saying, where'd this come from? I never saw this. I never approved this. Sometimes it's true. Sometimes it's because somebody failed to get their initials or signature. So make sure people sign off on these things early on, because then it will prevent somebody from saying later on, I never agreed to this, what is this, or why did you do it? You also keep in your TPP a decision log. There's a conflict resolution system because you have your go, no-go rationale, and you can then document, did you meet it, did you not, what were the issues, and you document what decisions were made, why they were made, and the next step, which serves as your conflict resolution system. Typical TPP checklist, I'm not going to read through this, and this is not even complete. It largely does map to your final label, but includes things such as unmet need, you know, your scientific rationale, preclinical support, and also not just FDA, but any international or world regulatory guidances that are available or applicable go in there. So again, great reference to carry with you all the time to see where you are, why you're there, and where you need to go. So just a couple of examples of some of the things that are in the TPP. You obviously have your indications and usage. You need a detailed description of what is the drug product. Is it for treatment or prevention? Or some other use, but exactly what is the intended use, the disease, the condition, the patients. And then you keep a running tabulation, a running list of annotations in the TPP where you have your completed and your planned studies supporting that target. For completed studies, a TPP will contain the results or links to all the results. And they all have a comment section. It doesn't have to be exactly what's said here, but this would be an example. You would summarize the drugs currently used for treatment or prevention and your target indication, and a statement on their competitive positioning. Similarly, for dosage and administration, it's not straightforward. It's not, do I give 1 pill or 2 a day? I think everybody knows that. But how much drug is required? That would map to your dose ranging studies. How is it administered? Is once a day adequate because of the PK or the PD characteristics? Does it have to be more than that? What studies will you have to run in order to get those answers? Duration of treatment. Again, annotations summarize everything that's been done to date and everything that remains. And a comment section, again, which would describe where you are in your TPP relative to your target. The results you've received so far, does that change where you might have to be shooting for? Adverse reactions, again, what is your target? What do you expect? What has been seen in previous studies? And this one over in the lower left is important. What adverse effects are acceptable based on potential risk, benefit, and positioning? You know, and too often people don't consider both risk and benefit. If your drug has a whopping benefit, you know, if it's to treat type of cancer and it causes vomiting in 90% of patients, but it works well, that's likely going to be tolerated. If it's an antidepressant and 90% of people throw up, you know, obviously not. So, you know, that example is maybe a little ludicrous, but you certainly need to map out what risks you can take given the benefit of these drugs, and the benefits often are more limited than we as individual drug developers or sponsors want to admit. You need to have a realistic assessment of that. And again, annotation talking about all the data to date. Adverse reactions, again, same thing with, on the right side here, comparing to similar product monographs, acceptable thresholds as we've talked about. And don't forget about opportunities to demonstrate superior safety profiles. So often, companies are just afraid of comparing something head-to-head, especially in safety, because they might find out that it's not as safe, that there aren't as many AEs. you know, in today's day and age, with so much communication, if your drug is unfavorable in terms of adverse events, it's not going to take long for that to be figured out in the marketplace. And unfortunately, it's not going to take long for lawyers to want to come after you and say, why didn't you test this? You should have known. You should have looked at it. Sometimes that's fair. Very often it's not. But if you have opportunities to demonstrate how your safety profile compares to other products, and hopefully it's better, I would encourage you to think about it, because you know, I've done it before in clinical studies, and it can be done successfully, and it's great competitive positioning to be able to say, yes, we've done the study, and actually they do cause sexual dysfunction in 60%, and we only cause it in 10%, and yes, we looked head-to-head. Clinical studies, I think I've almost covered this already, so you can read through this, but again, safety profile. Your endpoints have to map to what you need to position the product, and that needs to be mapped to those unmet patient needs and unmet needs that the prescribers have helped you identify. And again, annotation and comments. Some additional considerations, again, the list is not exhaustive, but your non-clinical requirements, that needs to be in your TPP. Enrollment challenges, and I love this graphic of the snail and loading, because enrollment often seems that way. That can go into your TPP, because enrollment challenges often have a lot to do with the clinical design of the studies, and maybe the study is overloaded and you need to keep track of enrollment and any challenges there, because that informs future development. Time to market. Your groundwork for subsequent indications, that's something to think about, not necessarily to interject or interpose in the middle of your main clinical development plan, because that can take you astray, but be thinking about subsequent indications, biomarkers, and companion diagnostics, which more and more are becoming available, important, and desired by patients, prescribers, and payers. Some common pitfalls. Okay, so this lady made it to New York. I don't really like the slide. It kind of makes me nervous, that picture, but hopefully nothing this serious. But interdisciplinary input not sought. I gave examples early on of what happens when you don't have all the key people at the table. You get halfway through, somebody's not happy, or you realize that you should have gotten some input that you didn't. Interest group driven targets. This could mean outside interest groups. Sometimes that happens, but actually I was more referring to internal interest groups. Somebody has a pet whatever. It could be a scientist, you know, who wants to save the world. Could be a marketer who thinks this is going to be a blockbuster, who then drives a disproportionate amount of your clinical development program. You know, listen to those people, because they sometimes have good input. But again, you don't want primary targets driven by special interests, because that can really derail you quickly. Lack of regulatory intelligence. This does not mean that the regulators aren't intelligent. It means that you need to thoroughly understand the regulatory landscape, the applicable regulations and requirements. Don't try to short-circuit stuff. Don't try to pull things over on the FDA or regulators. You will get the best results with any regulator, you know, if you go in knowing exactly, you know, where you might have fallen short and being frank about discussing it. And having all of that done ahead of time. As I've already said, you've got to have prospective key decision points. You've got to revisit the TPP when new data are obtained. You might not make it to New York. You might not make it to your exact target. And then you need to decide, you know, whether that money is better spent somewhere else, or maybe you can have a lesser target that will still be helpful to the company, patients, and prescribers. Failure to use it as a tool for planning and development. And I'll quickly give, and I've already really given this, and I see I'm over time, but whenever you start developing something, start with what's known. So if it's an antidepressant, you're going to need something that works at least half the time. You can't have drug interactions. Once a day is great, not required, but great. You can read the rest. The bottom line being, the world doesn't need another expensive variation of a currently marketed antidepressant. So when you do your TPP, you know you need a once-a-day antidepressant, no significant drug interactions, and one or more of the following: the rapid onset, good tolerability, robust efficacy. If you start to not see this, you're not going to arrive. So this would be kind of a general figurative example of what goes in the TPP and how it's used. This is the busiest slide, but I can spend probably the least amount of time on it. This is your general development flow chart. Every place you see a circle is where you're looking at that TPP and saying, did we make it or did we not make it? And then revising your assessments of where you need to go with this product and with this project, how you need to change it, and do you need to stop it and rethink it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Minnick. I appreciate your patience for the last 25 minutes.
Thank you, Jack. I'm going to now switch gears and talk about the development of the Integrated Product Development Plan, which is the next step in drug development planning process. It begins with the target product profile and lays out the necessary functional area plans and integrated cross-functional activities that are needed to achieve the desired product profile and label claims. Again, this product should be developed as early on in the drug development process as possible, similar to the target product profile. When drug development programs fail, often it's due to inadequate planning. Additionally, it's also important, as Jack described earlier, to take into consideration all of the data that are available on the drug product, the target class, the indication, and the marketing strategy, and use it to inform the next steps in the development plan. Okay, here we go. All right. Shown here, the Integrated Product Development Plan provides the functional area studies and activities that are needed to bridge from the target product profile to the label. As with the target product profile, the Integrated Product Development Plan is also a living document. New data and key information are used to revisit and refine the plan as they become available. It is also a strategic and dynamic tool, taking into consideration marketing strategy, the competitive landscape, and lays out the goals, activities, and contingencies that are needed to move the program from concept through marketing authorization. There are a lot of interdependent activities that need to be considered, as well as, and as Jack had mentioned, milestones and go, no-go decision points are also brought forward into the Integrated Product Development Plan. The Integrated Product Development Plan also begins with the end in mind, in this case marketing approval with desired labeling claims. And shown here is the Integrated Development Plan begins with mapping out the phase 3 studies, taking into consideration the labeling claims for efficacy and safety, the intended indication, the target population. Phase 1 and 2 studies are designed then to support the phase 3 studies. And then non-clinical and CMC plans are designed to support the clinical program and marketing authorization, and for CMC also commercialization. Similar to the target product profile, the Integrated Product Development Program is comprehensive and it is evolving. Elements are taken from the target product profile to develop comprehensive plan and integrated cross-disciplinary activities. New data are used to evaluate the plan and contingency plans, and the plan may be revised, and go, no-go decisions will need to be considered based on the new data that's input from as you go through the product development plan. Shown here is a typical timeline for a therapeutic from concept through marketing authorization, and shown on the left side of the panel are the different functional areas. A multidisciplinary team is essential to bring a product from concept through marketing authorization, and laid out here in high level are some of the key activities that are ongoing for each of these functional areas. What you can see is that there are a lot of parallel activities, and there are a lot of interdependent activities that require predecessors and close collaboration. Thus, project management is absolutely imperative to bring a product through successfully and navigating it through the process of drug development through marketing authorization and ultimately to commercialization. And examples of that would be the toxicology information may be needed to support the clinical development program, not only for the initial IND, but for clinical studies throughout the IND program. In addition, chemistry, manufacturing, and controls will be supplying drug substance and drug product for non-clinical and clinical studies. The Integrated Product Development Program is a written program, and is shown here are the basic content and elements for beginning to draft an Integrated Product Development Program. The introduction can include information on the disease, the target population, the indication, the competitor landscape, and the marketing strategy, such as, is the marketing strategy for global marketing? Elements of the target label from the target product profile are then described, and the clinical development program is mapped to ensure that the target labels, intended, desirable target label programs are addressed in the clinical plans. Non-clinical development plans are designed to support the clinical plan as well as marketing authorization. And the chemistry and manufacturing plans are designed to support non-clinical, clinical, marketing authorization, and commercialization. Last but not least, the regulatory history and strategy should be laid out taking into consideration pre-IND through marketing authorization. This may include a global strategy, which would need to take into consideration regional differences and regulatory body expectations and requirements, and that may impact not only the clinical plans, but also CMC and marketing authorization. Taking on Jack's earlier example for a novel antidepressant, the target product profile can be mapped to the various functional areas of the Integrated Product Development Plan. In this instance, the global market intention impacts all functional areas in the design and planning of the studies and activities for each of the functional areas. The clinical studies need to be conducted not only in the United States, but also outside of the United States. Non-clinical and CMC plans need to take into consideration regulatory expectations and requirements for the different regions. And marketing and regulatory also need to take into consideration the global market and their strategies. The dose regimen, once daily oral dosing, desiring a rapid onset for a chronic indication, impact multiple functional areas here as well as shown, from clinical, non-clinical, CMC, and marketing. The desire to have multiple dose strengths impacts multiple functional areas and needs to be taken into consideration when planning clinical trials and for CMC and marketing. The intended patient population and efficacy endpoint goals, as described in the target product profile, impact multiple functional areas, clinical and marketing for sure, but also the intended patient population may impact the design of non-clinical studies. For example, if the studies were going to be conducted in juveniles, you may need to conduct your non-clinical studies in juvenile animals. A favorable side effect profile versus the gold standard, such as sedation, weight gain, and sexual dysfunction, impact not only the clinical programs as shown here, but also marketing, which isn't shown. There's an arrow, should be an arrow going there. And lack of drug interactions and lack of cardiovascular safety issues impacts not only your clinical programs, but also marketing plans. The clinical development plan, as I mentioned, is the first plan that is a good starting point after the target product profile. Begin by mapping out the phase 3 program, taking into consideration safety and efficacy, desired claims as described in the target product profile. The phase 3 studies form the major basis for marketing approval decisions and for labeling. They can be pivotal or confirmatory if they're adequate and well controlled, and this has been agreed upon with the FDA. Phase 2 studies are designed to support the phase 3 study. One outcome of the phase 2 study is selection of appropriate doses to investigate in phase 3. But phase 2 studies can also include studies to further define the outcomes and endpoints in the intended population. Phase 1 studies focus on safety, pharmacokinetics, and pharmacodynamics. First-in-human studies, such as single ascending dose or multiple ascending dose, are often conducted in normal healthy volunteers. Drug interaction studies, studies to assess cardiovascular safety, such as a thorough QT, studies to investigate the effect of food and bioavailability are also considered phase 1 studies, although they can occur at various times throughout the IND process. The non-clinical development plan, as I mentioned, is designed to support the clinical plan and ultimately marketing authorization. There are numerous regulatory guidances that describe the requirements for a non-clinical safety program, and I encourage you to look at them. There's International Conference on Harmonization, as well as FDA guidances and OECD guidances. The non-clinical development plan, the end goal is to provide a comprehensive assessment of pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, and toxicity of drug substance and drug product. The data are used to select doses for initial clinical trials, to describe a therapeutic index, and to form a clinical program in terms of specific safety monitoring and use in specific populations. The results of several of these studies are described in the package insert. Good laboratory practice is required for conducting some of these studies, such as general toxicology studies, all of the toxicology studies, in fact, that are pivotal, toxicokinetic studies, and safety pharmacology studies to assess effects on organ systems such as cardiovascular, central nervous system, and respiratory system. And last but not least, dose selection is absolutely critical for conducting safety studies. There's actually a good description of dose selection in many of the available guidances from FDA, as well as the International Conference on Harmonization. So I encourage you to read that and take into consideration the need to conduct dose range finding studies in advance of your pivotal toxicology studies and safety studies so that you're loaded with success in the design of those studies. Now I'm going to turn over the talk to Scott Burian, who's going to talk about CMC and regulatory activities in the Integrated Development Plan.
Great. Thank you very much, Dana. So we're going to switch gears a little bit, and let me just get control here. Okay. So today, now we're going to talk about the chemistry, manufacturing, controls portion of your Integrated Product Development Plan. And the focus here is to develop the roadmap for those activities that will allow you to provide FDA with sufficient information to assure that your drug meets the applicable quality requirements for your stage of development. So to begin the process, one of the first things that a sponsor needs to plan for is securing adequate supplies of the active pharmaceutical ingredient or the drug substance. Now, if you're repurposing maybe an older drug and the API is commercially available, that might not be an issue. But for earlier stage programs where, or rather new chemical entities where, your manufacturing scale initially is quite limited, it's critical to estimate how much material is going to be required to support all of your necessary development activities. So the CMC activities must be planned in close coordination with the proposed non-clinical and clinical programs that have been spec'd out based on the TPP and that are already being built into your integrated product development plan. Because we're going to need to take into account not only the non-clinical safety studies to begin development, but we're going to need to do analytical method development, formulation development, manufacture of dosage form prototypes, and manufacture of your clinical trial material that you're actually going to put into your study, and obviously then have sufficient material to conduct the necessary stability studies. Any gap in API at any point along here can put your whole program on hold and put your program in jeopardy. So when developing your integrated product development plan, there needs to be frequent discussions between your non-clinical group, your CMC group, and your clinical group. Just as an example, one of the first things that kicks off the whole process is starting your non-clinical program. Well, that may happen a year to a year and a half before filing your IND. So when planning your API supply, there needs to be discussion with the toxicologist as to how much API is needed and when. Similarly with clinical, has the TPP been fully fleshed out? Are the clinical trial material design requirements clearly defined with respect to the route of administration, dosage form, and dose proposed in the protocol? Because all this information will then be integrated into your product development plan when you're designing the necessary pre-formulation and formulation development studies. And then when you actually get to manufacturing your clinical trial material, the CMC group will again need to interact with the clinical group to make sure that we know the size and duration of the clinical trial. What are the packaging and labeling requirements? Is the drug going to be administered in the pharmacy at the site, or is the patient going to take it home? Is a patient kit required? Is the study double-blind? What kind of comparator will be needed, active or placebo? These kind of things are very important to integrate into your product development plan, because matching a dosage form, maybe shape, color, or masking a taste can take a significant amount of time and really needs to be integrated into your overall product development plan timelines. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about really kind of the last section of your integrated product development plan, which is the regulatory strategy section. So by this point, you should know what type of product you're developing. Is it a NCE? Are you repurposing an old drug? Is it a generic, or maybe a drug-device combination? When you answer this question, that's going to then dictate what approval pathways are open to you. But each one of these pathways may have different non-clinical and clinical requirements. So it's critical to understand and plan for any known regulatory hurdles in your integrated product development plan. As Jack alluded to earlier, you got to understand your competition. So reviewing existing product labels, looking at summary basis of approvals for competitor products, or EPARs, which are European Public Assessment Reports, and that can be found on the EMA website. It's basically the SBA equivalent. Provides a lot of good information. And finally, you'd be surprised what's available in financial reports of companies. So again, another good resource. Now, as you're working on your regulatory strategy, you have to be aware of region-specific regulations. Now, most of us know that ICH is a harmonized standard around the world, right? Well, there are still differences between the FDA and the EMA in Europe and also in Japan. So you really want to have an understanding of what's going on the ground where you expect to be. Now, as you're putting, again, your regulatory strategy section of your integrated product development plan, you want to know, does your drug qualify for any of the facilitatory programs that FDA offers? Is your product an orphan drug? You might be applicable to receive some development grants. Are you developing a product for a serious, life-threatening, unmet medical need? Well, there's a number of acceleration mechanisms that might be available to you, such as breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, priority review. Knowing your drug and the intended population can allow you to integrate the benefits of these programs into your integrated product development plan timelines. So let's talk about meeting with the FDA. So typically, a lot of interaction is face-to-face, and there's three types of meeting, type A, B, and C. That we're going to talk today really about the type B meetings, because these meetings are the most common across any development program. So type B meetings consist of a pre-IND meeting, end of phase 1 meeting, the end of phase 2, and then the pre-NDA meeting. And right now I'm going to focus on initially the pre-IND meeting. So this is really a meeting that's going to occur very early in the development of your product, and it's your first interaction with the agency to expose the FDA to your product, introduce it, and see if you can get on the same page. So the focus of this meeting is to obtain agency buy-in on your clinical protocol, your non-clinical safety studies, and your CMC program. Now, for this meeting, you're going to have to put together a briefing document. So basically what you want to do here is integrate or translate what you've developed in your integrated product development plan and put that into your briefing document, which you're going to have to submit prior to holding this meeting. Now, as you're putting together your briefing document, you want to be formulating direct, clear, well-written questions. When you have an open-ended question, it's very often that we've seen clients of ours get very vague or open-ended responses back from FDA that do not provide any additional clarity on that question. So then we're in a space where we really don't know which is the right pathway forward. So when is the right time to schedule a meeting? Well, in a perfect world, as late as possible, when you have as much information to have excellently written questions. But we all know in the real world, it's always a balance between scientific and corporate needs. And I'm sure many of you have gone through where corporate needs have won out, and you've gone to a pre-IND meeting before you really thought you were ready. But why is it important to plan? Well, drug development is a complex undertaking, and effective planning of your development program is extremely important in avoiding regulatory delays. Now, we all know once an IND is filed, you always hear from management, when is day 30? When are we going to get that clearance letter? So what are the chances that your IND will clear? Well, let's look at an example. In any given year, CDER receives approximately 1,500 submissions, IND submissions. Now, in a recent study, and I apologize, the citation there moved a little bit, but this was the Journal of Investigative Medicine. This was an article that came out in January of this year, and they looked at INDs that were submitted in 2013. And of those 1,500, 9% were placed on clinical hold. The most commonly cited reasons were CMC, then followed by clinical and toxicological concerns. So what I'm showing you here is a list of common reasons for clinical hold. This was put together by an industry trade group some years ago. I'm not going to go through each one here, but the take-home message I want to point out is that all of the companies that submitted these INDs thought they did their homework, thought they did the right studies, thought they had well-written INDs. But for whatever reason, their integrated product development plans, or lack thereof, didn't account for these issues. So at the end of this is the end of our presentation. What I'd like you to take home today is that understanding your drug, a well-developed integrated product development plan, and effective agency interactions will increase the chances of a successful IND. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and I think we'll move to the Q&A.
Everyone, now let's move on to the Q&A. There is still time to submit your questions using the Q&A button in the lower left corner of your screen. We have lots of great questions already, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. First question from someone who greatly enjoyed the presentation. Jack, could you talk about managing unrealistic expectations from internal stakeholders?
Yes, thank you for that question. I feel like I've been called out because I'm giving this presentation like, hey, no big deal. It's a big love fest, and everybody will just agree and get along. It doesn't always work that way. And I think where people get into trouble is not sitting down early, recognizing everybody's expertise, their strengths, their weaknesses, and basically coming up with a common plan. So I'm right now sitting around the table with 5 other people, as you might often do when doing a TPP. And it's very easy for the discussions to be between 2 people who are arguing about what they think needs to go into the TPP or what they think needs to be in the development program. What you want to do is not focus on each other, on marketing's view versus medical's or operations versus regulatory, but to get all this down on a piece of paper in front of you where everybody agrees on the common goal. And one place they're all going to agree is we want a successful outcome. We want a successful product that's going to help patients, going to help prescribers, going to make money for the company. And I think if you always approach it that this is a common goal that everybody's trying to make together and it's not a one-upmanship, I think that really helps a lot. When there are disagreements, it's best usually not to do it in front of everybody because then people dig in and it becomes a personal thing. But you go and you sit down with the person that maybe you're not seeing eye to eye with or you can't get stakeholder agreement and say, you know, wow, I'm so excited about this development program. This medication has the potential to do whatever it is that you think they want to hear, whatever the medicine's going to do. And there are a couple of things I don't understand, and I have a couple of ideas. Can we brainstorm together to really get this thing off the ground and make it a success? And that usually goes pretty well. Now, sometimes it doesn't. And one of the things I finally had to realize, and those of you who know me know it took me a while to realize, is that I didn't get paid to run the company. And it's true for all of us. We get paid for our expert opinions, for what we can do. The CEO, who gets paid generally a lot more than we do, runs the company. So at some point, we have to say, no matter how great we think our idea or how bad we might think someone else's idea, we've got to check our egos at the door. It's about doing the best you can to help everybody meet this common goal. And then sometimes you do have to let it go. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful.
Great, thank you, Jack. Next question, can you share any examples of where you were able to convince a reluctant team to prepare a TPP and share it at an FDA meeting and the value of doing so? After 15 years in regulatory at 2 companies, I have not been on a single project team willing to do this.
Yeah, so I'll give you our sort of last resort. And we work with a lot of companies here. A lot of them don't want to do a TPP. A lot of them don't want to do an integrated product development plan. Some of them don't have the money to do that. So what we absolutely try to do is in our pre-IND briefing package, we lay out what is essentially the integrated product development plan through to marketing submission. So if we haven't gotten it from them by that point in time, we don't go to FDA without that fleshed out, the integrated product development plan. The TPP is a little bit more difficult to get established, but if you have an integrated product development plan, that's basically the details of the TPP. So if you elicited input from the experts in developing the integrated product development plan, it's generally on track. Next question.
Great, thank you. Yes, next question. How much should I budget for doing a TPP/IPDP for a pre-IND product?
I think that depends on how much money you have, to be honest, because whatever time you spend will be beneficial. As I said at the beginning, you can do it with a PowerPoint presentation with 10 slides. That's not as valuable as doing a more comprehensive integrated development plan and TPP, but you have the budget that you allocate to it. I don't think any money that you spend on either one of these 2 documents is wasted. So that would be my recommendation. Don't look at it how much it's going to cost. Do whatever you can. Spend whatever money you have on it up front.
I think just to add to that, this is Dana, to ensure that when you are planning those activities, that you have the multidisciplinary team there providing input.
Great, thank you. Who on the project team generally leads the preparation of the TPP, given the multidisciplinary input needed? Project lead, regulatory, project management, or others?
Ideally, it is a project manager infused with regulatory experience. So in a perfect world, the person leading this effort has taken a product, at least one product, if not many products to market and led an interdisciplinary team and understands the regulatory and marketing hurdles that need to be achieved. So that's the best case scenario. However, in my experience, I've even had MDs lead these teams, if you can believe that, and toxicologists, and have not worked with a CMC expert yet that has led an NDA, but I'm perfectly confident that Scott could do it if given the assignment. It's really having the project management skills necessary to drive this and to keep everybody informed as to what the decisions are and what progress has been made.
Great, thank you. Next question. What is your suggestion for very small startup companies to achieve some marketing input for their TPP, as they typically do not have this expertise on board?
There are, companies that provide this service. There are also, I think, independent consultants that are available who have worked for large pharma for many years and brought many products to market and have access to the information that they will need to help you. So they're out there and available.
Well, let us not forget that Roe has this expertise as well as many other CROs. So I don't want to be too partial, but a lot of CROs, including us, have this expertise in-house or through consultants and are happy to help.
Great, thank you. Do you know how many companies these days add the TPP to briefing documents for FDA meetings?
In our experience, I would say less than 25%.
Right. I have recent experience where oftentimes the TPP is developed fairly late in the drug development process, but even if it is at an end of phase 2 meeting or at a pre-NDA meeting, it's still a useful tool.
Great, thank you. Let's try and fit in a couple more questions. I am developing a drug for an ultra-rare life-threatening disease for which there are currently no therapies available. Under what, if any, circumstances will FDA be willing to consider a streamlined clinical and or non-clinical development program?
Well, what falls to you is to design the streamlined. As long as it's adequate, it can be streamlined, but it's your job to come up with that development plan, lay out what makes sense from a safety perspective and from a scientific perspective, and to take that to FDA in your pre-IND briefing book and convince them that this is what's needed to get this product on the market. And you should take advantage, as Scott pointed out, of the potential for having an end of phase 1 meeting to propose accelerated approval pathway and lay out all the way through approval, including priority review, and request breakthrough therapy designation along the line.
Great, thank you. This will be our final question. We had a lot of great questions today and couldn't get to them all, but we will be getting back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. What is the best way to establish assumptions in a product development program? Too many assumptions will make the plan unrealistic and not achievable.
I think I'll let Jack speak to this too, but really make sure you consult enough experienced integrated product developers in each of the disciplines. They will have done this, they will have been down this road, they will know what assumptions are realistic and what assumptions are, stratospheric. And so you just need to bite the bullet and do what's practical and what has a good chance of success, as opposed to taking chances. I had one CMC mentor tell me once that, well, that's got a 95% chance of success. The problem is if you string, 10 decisions with a 95% chance of success together, you're going to fail. So you've got to know what's practical and what your probability of success is, and then lay that plan out.
Yeah, and I'll just add quickly, I totally agree. You've got to have the expertise on board. I realized that I got spoiled at GSK. GSK had so many wonderful, brilliant people who work so well together. And now when I work with other companies, mostly smaller companies, I realize there's no way you can have all that expertise in one place, although sometimes that doesn't stop people from thinking they have it. So I would say consult early and often with people or groups that can provide that expertise and be a litmus test for whether your assumptions are achievable or whether they're just pure aspiration. Which brings me, I guess, my final point, something to avoid in drug development, and your TPP can help you with, and that is avoiding the first law of Walt Disney, which is wishing will make it true. That only works inside the Magic Kingdom. So that's where you need to get the input. You need to have those go, no-go criteria in your integrated plan, and not to just think that through a hope or a prayer somehow you're going to get through this. It's very methodical, objective, and stepwise.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for attending this Fierce Live webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Ro for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours on the same page you used to register for this event. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.